This is Brynne Lawrence with China Freedom File with your weekly news update. 31 years ago this week, the Chinese military opened fire on students gathered in Tiananmen Square. The students were part of a pro-democracy movement that had taken the nation by storm and had traveled to the square from throughout the country, demanding policy reform. On the evening of June 3rd, the Chinese military fired the first shots of what became known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre. The next day, they advanced on the square, killing many. Even though the massacre may have crushed the student movement, persistence for reform has remained a prominent part of China's political landscape. China's abuses have continued into this day. In more recent times, unrest has risen in Hong Kong, where China is implementing a national security law. Similar laws in mainland China have been used to target religious people and political activists, prompting fears that Hong Kong's rights are being quickly eroded by the Chinese government. Just this week, an annual candlelight vigil was held in Hong Kong despite a police ban. Local residents gathered despite the ban, intent on honoring the memory of those who gave their lives for freedom. In mainland China, a family has been questioning the death of human rights activist Li Jinhong, who died after being hit by a car in April. Police have told the Li family that Li was equally responsible for his death, even though there is evidence that the car may have sped up prior to hitting him. The family has hired a lawyer to combat this case. In response to global religious freedom abuses, President Trump has issued an executive order ordering the United States to uphold international religious freedom. Within the order, Trump called religious freedom a moral and national security imperative. He went on to ask Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to develop a plan to prioritize international religious freedom in the planning and implementation of United States foreign policy and in the foreign assistance programs of the Department of State and the USAID. For more information on these stories, please visit ChinaAid.org. Again, my name is Brynne Lawrence, and you've been watching China Freedom File. Have a good day.
Friends, welcome back to China Freedom File. Thank you, Brent, for broadcasting the summary of religious freedom and rule of law in China and Hong Kong and globally. I want to focus today primarily on what's happening in Hong Kong and what had been transpired from kind of one country, two system to today's one country, one system, the Chinese communist system. And that is the topic I want to focus on today. Back to 31 years ago, this month of May, I was sitting in the Tiananmen Square along with thousands of other students as one of the students' leaders from my university. And we were just peaceful protesters calling for more democracy, freedom, and less corruption. And as we all witnessed and experienced what had happened, that the Chinese communist regime with its military hardliners sent the machine guns and sent tanks and ruling over and killed and murdered thousands of innocent citizens and students in the early morning of June 4th, 1989. And today, we are seeing some dangerous kind of signs that there could be another repeat of the Tiananmen Square. This time could be in Victoria Park, could be in the downtown of Hong Kong. As the whole world, many of you had watched the news in the past 6 months or so, the Hong Kong citizens took to the street and protest the communist regime's effort try to forcefully pass extradition law that, according to that extradition law, basically any citizens, any even passengers or just temporary residents in Hong Kong, no matter you're Hong Kong permanent residents or just a foreigner who tour Hong Kong, if you're deemed as like a criminal or as a suspect of a criminal, according to the extradition law, you would be subject for extradition, expelled or taken back to mainland China for trial. I mean, we all know what that meant with the Chinese Communist Party viciously violating its basic commitment of human rights and rule of law and human rights, the other freedoms to the Chinese citizens. And now, this could be so dangerous. So that's why, as many as 3 million Hong Kongers at one day even took to the street, protested, and singing Hallelujah. Singing Hallelujah to the Lord became protesters one of the anthem on the street. It was so touching, I think, when you witness that. But things actually, are getting way worse, even since the coronavirus pandemic, when no protest was even allowed during this time. And instead of easing the international concern and the outrage by the Hong Kong citizens jointly, just a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese regime, during their National People's Congress time, rubber-stamped legislation, basically for the first time since Hong Kong was handed over to China by the British authorities in 1997. The Chinese regime imposed a so-called Hong Kong National Security Law. As we all know, the Chinese government already have a national security law in place that, according to that national security law in the mainland China, any Chinese citizens who live in mainland China could be arrested arbitrarily, could be under enforced disappearance, could be detained and put under a secret location if you are deemed as a national security threat. For instance, if you are a dissident who posts a message online and just protest the Communist Party's violation of rule of law, or forcefully remove a petitioner or jail democracy activist, or even put a human rights lawyer in torture chamber, or forcefully jail them and indoctrinate them in a psychiatric hospital. So these are all done under the pretext of the national security law to the Chinese citizens in the mainland China. And now, after this new national security law in Hong Kong, basically the Chinese communist regime's intention is to extend the coverage of the application of this law to the Hong Kong territory. So this is astonishing, and it's very chilling. It's astonishing because in 1984, when the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, signed a joint declaration with then Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang, they made a very solemn international commitment in that declaration, which is registered in the United Nations as an international commitment. like a treaty. The Chinese regime made a commitment by declaring to the United Kingdom, certainly to the whole world, that after Hong Kong was turned over to China in 1997, at least 40 years, Hong Kong is guaranteed with the so-called design of one country, two systems. That means, one country with the socialist system still, of course, remained in the mainland China, and Hong Kong can still keep it a capitalist system, which specifically means the basic rule of law, and the religious freedom, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, independent judiciary, and certainly democratic reform or democratic elections to their local leaders, at least except the chief executive, that with the promise to gradual for a universal suffrage, means a true vote by every Hong Kong citizens for electing the leaders. But 1997 and this year is 2020. So barely 23 years later, the Chinese regime reversed its course. And basically, when this Hong Kong national security law was announced and imposed, it marked the death of the one country, two systems. It essentially, as Secretary Pompeo and President Trump announced, that the Hong Kong has already entered into the one country, one system. It means one country, one communist system now is in place in Hong Kong. It is very chilling as well. It sent a very terrifying signal that according to the design of this Hong Kong national security law, not only the citizens in Hong Kong, but also almost 1 million foreigners who either are staying there, doing business, including 85,000 Americans, and certainly lots of the citizens from the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth of the United Kingdom. And I think they are all, not I think, according to this law, they are all in danger. According to this law, if you are found or deemed as an associate or with a relationship or connection with those any of the protesters, with any Hong Kong democracy activists, including with their legislators who are duly elected by the Hong Kong citizens, and according to this law, you are deemed as a national security threat. You are deemed as subverting of the national state power. You are deemed as a collaborator with the overseas hostile forces. You are deemed as they try to disintegrate the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China. So these are all in the mainland China called national security crimes. And now everything is going to apply to the Hong Kong citizen and all the foreigners, even those passengers who travel to Hong Kong. And I have firsthand experience with some contrast that because after the bloody crackdown against the protesters, and in 1989, 31 years ago, I became a Christian and later on became an underground house church leader in Beijing. And although my daytime job was teaching English to the Chinese Communist Party leaders, So I was teaching ABC to these Communist Party leaders at the Beijing Party School of Chinese Communist Party. That was my daytime job. And in the evening and the weekend, I was really as busy as any preachers and church planters, riding my bicycles from one university campus to another, and planting churches and start gospel fellowships, and essentially because of the need for seminary education, I even started underground Bible school in the suburb of Beijing. That was in 1995, 1996, and the most humorous thing, I think that shows another attributes of God. God is a humorous God. We rarely mention about that. Was by the end of each month, I always get a paycheck as a full-time faculty in the Chinese Communist Party school directly from the Chinese Communist Party as my mission fund. And how can you find a better deal than that? But God is also having a greater purpose when I was doing that. And then in 1997, like many other Chinese house church pastors and missionaries, evangelists, my wife and I were both thrown into jail, and the charge or the accusation to us in 1996 was engaging the illegal evangelism or illegal religious activities, 非法传教. So we were thrown into a Beijing prison, and in May of 1996, and then after 2 months in prison, we were released and immediately put under house arrest. And then it was during that time, really by the grace of the Lord, because the communist security officials still did not let us go, and we were under house arrest. And then my wife Heidi was pregnant without permission, even for the first child, because I was working in the Communist Party school, treated as a civil servant. So you have to get a pregnancy permission quota before you can get pregnant, and so otherwise, the real danger is if you are caught, then the pregnant women like my wife Heidi could be kidnapped and dragged to the hospital and forcefully have a forced abortion. And so by the grace of the Lord, we, after hiding in the countryside from Beijing, we were able to escape to Hong Kong. So that's, my kind of memory of Hong Kong started. So that was about October 1996. And initially, when Heidi and I landed in Hong Kong, being secretly protected by some American missionaries there and helped by some Hong Kong democracy friends and the old Hong Kong government, still under the last British governor of Hong Kong, the Chris Patton, was still operating. So Heidi and I were thinking and praying that before the handover to Hong Kong on July 1st, 1997, the next year, we would be kind of accepted, taken or kind of to another country in a free world as refugees. So we applied and we were waiting anxiously, of course, with lots of prayers from around the world. But I want to really point out my impression, my personal impression of Hong Kong at that time. Although we witnessed as the Hong Kong handover to China countdown and approaching to the July 1st, 1997, there had been a very widespread anxiety, the fear of Chinese communist takeover of Hong Kong. There's massive exodus, immigration exodus. I think hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongese immigrant out of Hong Kong before July 1st. But at least when I went out, took Hong Kong subways and visit some of the tourist sites or Kowloon Bay and this different sites. I see my observation was the Hong Kong police was very polite, was a very law-abiding and very caring a group of law enforcers. And so that's why when we saw that this year, how brutal, how violent, and how vicious, the Hong Kong police force had been showing toward the protesters, the youngest one protester was like 12 years old. The eldest one was like over 80 years old, and including many were disappeared, and some were documented. Young university female students were raped, and some were beaten so violently. So the whole impression was totally reversed, at least in my impression, and I felt that certainly is a chilling signal. It shows Hong Kong, at least from the Hong Kong chief executive and her leaders under her, to the law enforcement, so-called, the police. I think they had been already transformed by the Chinese Communist security forces. We already have seen evidence. Some of those brutal police force actually were fake Hong Kong police. They were the Chinese secret agents from the Chinese well-trained state security agents and the Ministry of Public Security and Ministry of State Security. So they already entered into Hong Kong, stationed into Hong Kong. Of course, there are already clear evidence showing the Chinese military in their camp in Hong Kong. Under the agreement, the Hong Kong allows the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the same type of military who had massacred thousands of innocent citizens in Beijing Tiananmen Square 31 years ago, had already stationed in Hong Kong. But they pretend to be Hong Kong police force and just wearing Hong Kong police uniform, and began already their crackdown. So this new Hong Kong new national security law actually just provide a legal legitimacy to cover up, to enshrine legitimize the brutality in the name of national security. So I think the whole world, certainly the free world, like the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, the like-minded free world, both governments and the freedom-loving people should absolutely be alarmed and take action to hold the Chinese regime and its action accountable. as Brent as Brent just reported before the program, I'm very thankful that the United States government and U.S. Congress, from both parties, this is not a partisan issue. The Communist Party's threat to not only the Hong Kong needs, but really the whole world. We should take concrete actions. And President Trump already announced that the action will be taken is under a very concrete and serious consideration to revoke the Hong Kong's preferential trade status under the U.S.-Hong Kong relations law that passed in 1997 after the handover. The Hong Kong was treated like a free trade harbor, and so every year $500 billion worth of goods had been going on, trading with the United States. And so Hong Kong enjoy a tariff-free, even those products from mainland China and who went through Hong Kong was treated as made in Hong Kong products, and also there's extradition cooperation for the criminal activities between Hong Kong and United States. If Hong Kong is controlled by the Chinese communist security agencies, there's no way we should cooperate with them. And certainly, and Hong Kong has been used as a hub for the Chinese Communist Party agencies to exploit their, their financial smugglings. So lots of other things we can talk about, and a lot of other measures we can take. So my request to all of you is, I hope after you are being informed, and we can continue to pray for the stability and pray for accountability and for those perpetrators in Hong Kong for the brutality. So thank you very much for your attention. May God continue to bless all of you.
Order your copy of this program from the GLC bookstore by calling the numbers or visiting the website on your screen. Please include the program number when ordering.